Okay, I hope, is my microphone working? Yes. Thank you all for coming out. I know it's cold out, so we're here in the elements together, and the fact that you're out here means that you care about what's happening to our kids today, because, you know, I'm also a parent. I'm five. I've got 17-year-old twin sons as well, so I'm a parent and a clinician and having an educator, and these are strange times to be raising kids and children. So the fact that you're here in the cold means that you care to maybe find out a little bit more about just what some of these effects are with our kids, with our young ones. So just, you know, all the things that you read, thank you for reading all those things, but we're just here to talk about what might be happening. Sometimes it gets a little bit embarrassing to be like, yeah, this is a hot topic because, you know, in the last 10 to 15 years, things have changed so dramatically, what I like to say seismically, with how young people experience the world in terms of how they process information, how they are educated in school, how they live their day-to-day lives. You know, screen time, which, you know, when I wrote Glow Kids in 2016, I was a bit of a voice in the wilderness saying, hey, there might be some effects, some unintended consequences with our love affair with our shiny little gadgets. What might be happening that we're under-aware of? And so interestingly, you know, as many of you know, we're going through a mental health crisis. And really the main thrust of the conversation that I want to have is what is the intersection or the nexus point between our love affair with screen time and this mental health crisis that we're having. So we're having record rates of suicide, depression, anxiety, attentional disorders, all sorts of self-harm issues, and they've all had reached a pinnacle right before COVID. In 2019, we had reached record levels of, so we had over 42,000 suicides nationally. We had over 70,000 overdoses. Depression was at an all-time high. Anxiety was at an all-time high. And then COVID was kerosene to an already burning fire, where not only were people struggling with their mental health, but it was disproportionately impacting young people. So when you look at our mental health crisis, which is what we're going through, and it's been in the news a lot lately, you know, the mental health crisis that we're all going through, it's disproportionately affecting younger and younger people. And what I mean by that is when you look at generational cohorts, when you look at baby boomers, and then Gen X, and then millennials, and then Gen Z, and then Gen Alpha, and you go down the generational ladder, each cohort is getting more and more psychiatrically unwell. The metrics get worse and worse the younger the person gets. So the healthiest people by psychiatric metrics, the lowest rates of depression, the lowest rates of suicide, are baby boomers. And yet the most unwell tend to be Gen Z and millennials. 1 out of 4 millennials have 0 friends. The suicide rates, the overdose rates, disproportionately impacting the younger people that happen to be the most plugged in. And that wasn't really the narrative that, you know, those of us that are old enough to remember the before times, before we really got swallowed up by the digital age, before social media, before smartphones, the promise of our new technological world was, what was the promise? It was going to be connectivity, and people were going to be able to come together in more impactful and meaningful ways. And it was this idea that social media or digital technologies were going to be a good thing in our lives. And look, there are some wonderful things about technology. I'm not here to say that we should all go Amish. I want to show Exhibit A. Look, by the smartphone, right? By objectively, as a bit of technology, these are amazing. This is an amazing portal to all the information in the world. You can access more information than the Library of Alexandria through the portal of your smartphone. And so as a technological tool, it's pretty amazing. But unfortunately, I think what was happening is while we were awestruck by how cool our phones were, we weren't noticing the unintended consequences of what was happening to our infants, kids, and teenagers as they started getting more and more seduced or sucked into their phone time. And what we were underaware of, what happened, I think, sociologically, a lot of us who were raised on TV, I mean, I was raised on TV as a kid, I think many of us of a certain age conflated these with the later generation of smaller portable TVs. As a friend of mine said the other day, these were like TVs on the go. So a lot of us thought, what can go wrong? We grew up on TV, we're kind of okay. maybe these are just going to be smaller television sets. And the reality of it is there's a couple of reasons that make modern digital technology much more psychologically impactful than television. So the first and foremost is when we watched television way back when the TV was rabbit-eared in our living room sets when we were growing up as a kid. I remember I had a TV that you had to change the channel with the pliers because the knob would always fall off, and you had 5 channels, and you had 2, 5, 7, 9, 11, PIX, and the knob would fall off. It was a passive visual experience, right? So when I was watching Starsky and Hutch as a kid, not to date myself, but when we were watching anything on the television set, we were passive viewers of a visual experience. Today, when our kids are online, they are interactive participants of a digital experience. So they're not watching, they're in it. And so that makes it much more impactful in potentially good, but very often bad ways. So the effect is much more profound. They're much more ubiquitous. We never could put that big living room TV set in our back pocket, where this phone now can go with us everywhere, so the ubiquity of it. And finally, when we were watching TV, we didn't have predatory algorithms that were like heat-seeking missiles targeting each of us in a very curated, when I use the word predatory because the way that, as many of you may know, big tech really, really attacks people's psychological vulnerability in terms of content and recommended feeds. So when we talk about, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on in our talk, when the Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen, when she talked about Meta and Instagram specifically, had internal research that showed that adolescent female girls on Instagram had 14% higher rates of suicide because these predatory algorithms, if a young adolescent female had any kind of body image issues, the algorithm would bombard her with any kind of body image content that only inflamed the situation. So the Wall Street Journal had done an investigative report where they had created 13 fictitious bots that were the profile were adolescent females that had some kind of body image issue. And within 24 hours, there was hundreds of predatory types of content that were hashtag skin and bones, 100 calories or less, images of anorexia, images that were really harmful to any young female experiencing body image issues, but like a car wreck that we shouldn't be looking at, the participant couldn't look away, the user couldn't look away. So there was a very intentional tendency to try to inflame people's emotional reactions. Those of us that are interested in politics, we know how social media works, right? It's the more emotional reaction that you get, the more engagement you get. So social media tends to not be thoughtful and nuanced. It tends to be lizard brain and emotionally reacting because that's what keeps you watching. But it's also keeps our kids watching more in ways that are very potentially problematic. So I think what was happening is as we were, again, easing into this new digitized world, we weren't fully aware of not only how problematic these devices or platforms have been for our children, but also how it was affecting their cognitive development, their attentional impacts. They're habit forming by design, but habituation was just the price of admission. It's what was the cost to our kids who have been seduced, and tech addiction is a term that has some complexity to it, but any of you that have children that are on their devices for too much, what is the byproduct of that habituation? Yeah, Johnny and Susie may be on their phone or on their platform for too long, but what is that doing to their psychological profile? What's that doing to their personality, to their identity, to their sense of well-being? Those are some of the effects that I'd like to talk about because I think that our mental health crisis and our screen love affair are related. And there's a nexus that we need to understand if we're going to be thoughtful parents with how to immunize our kids as best as we can, because we're not going back to the before times. None of us have a magic, we're not going back to 1967, or we're not going to go Amish. And so how do we live in the digital age in ways that could be productive and healthy with our children and help them have the tools and the ability to be as productive as they can be, because the effects are pretty profound globally in terms of we have clinical impacts, we have identity issues, we have cognitive issues, certainly pedagogical learning impacts that we'll talk about. So this is sort of the globally kind of what I wanted to talk about. But let me ask you guys a couple of questions here, because we're talking about our kids, but it affects us as adults. So I just wanted to ask, by a show of hands, how many of you all in the audience feel that if I were to ask you, how many of you feel you have a little bit of an unhealthy relationship with your phone or with your devices? How many of you feel, thank you for your honesty. So the question then is, if we, the adults in the room, and I'm guilty also, my wife is here, she'll rat me out, and whenever you want to, she'll say that I maybe am too attached to my device as well. If the adults in the room with our fully developed frontal cortexes, our fully developed brains, if we have a hard time navigating and controlling ourselves around our devices, what chance do our 5-year-olds, our 10-year-olds, our 15-year-olds, who don't have a fully developed impulse control yet, prefrontal cortex executive functioning, to really navigate this really highly seductive, addicting world? So I want to do one more thought experiment with you all, just to give you a sense of what can happen when we are overly reliant on our digital technology. So if I had to ask each of you, and we'll make it a thought experiment because you all don't have pieces of paper and pen, but if I had to ask each of you, can you write down 10 phone numbers without looking at your smartphones? If you had to write down 10 phone numbers of your closest friends or family members, can you do 1 to 10 without looking at your phones? How many of you think you can do that? I mean, I won't call you out on it. I won't put you on the spot and make you do it. So a small minority of you. So let me see that again. How many of you think you can remember 10 phone numbers? Maybe 10%, maybe 10%. Again, I won't quiz you. I won't ask you to repeat 10 numbers. All right, 10 years ago, everyone in this room knew 10 phone numbers. What's happened is we've outsourced our memory to our phone's memory. And a lot of our cognitive abilities are use it or lose it. The more we use our memory, the more it can grow. And I'll tell you a little bit about an interesting experiment about that. The less you use any of your mental faculties, the more they atrophy. That's why when people have early onset dementia or Alzheimer's, they talk about Sudoku and crossword puzzles. You want to really keep your mind active, or else things atrophy. Well, memory is like that. And a lot of skills that we used to have innately are really atrophying because we've farmed them out to our technology or our phones. Memory keeps, our memory muscle is really, there's 2 parts of our brain that store memory. There's the amygdala and the hippocampus. And the hippocampus really stores factual memory, and the amygdala tends to store emotional memory. And they did a really fascinating study at the University of London about 10 years ago. They were studying, they wanted to study how memory can still, and how the hippocampus and memory can be affected across lifespan. And they looked at a bunch of people that were taking an exam called the Knowledge. In London, for a person to get licensed as a cab driver, they have to pass a test called the Knowledge. Now, some of you may know London has a very arcane, labyrinthine streets, and to know where you're going without GPS in London, it's really memorization. You have to memorize about 10,000 streets. And so that test called the Knowledge was a pure memorization test. So people that would take the London cab licensing exam would study for it for about 4 years. And some people said it was a harder exam than the MCATs to get into medical school. It was a really hard memorization test. So they took a bunch of these folks who were going to prepare for these 4 years to study to take this London cab driver's test. And they did an MRI before each of them started preparing for their 4 years. And then they did post-MRIs 4 years later on the people who passed the exam. Now, most of these people were in their 30s, 40s, and some of them were in their 50s. Their hippocampus, the ones who passed the exam, who spent every day memorizing, almost doubled in size. So this idea that our brains are kind of static once we reach 21, that they stop developing, is a bit of a myth. And our cognitive abilities, our memory, our intellectual faculties, they still keep developing. But again, use it and lose it. The lazier we get mentally, the more some of those abilities will begin to atrophy. Your hippocampus gets smaller if you don't use it. And as I'll show you some of the brain imaging research, screen time has a very negative neurophysiological effect on our brain. It actually begins to shrink it in a very similar way that substance addiction shrinks our brains. So there's some real neurophysiological effects, there's some real social effects, there's some real creativity effects with how much we're using and navigating through some of our devices. So, that's kind of the 30,000-foot view of a little bit of our conversation. Screen time, again, it can be a wonderful thing, but the one takeaway, if you get nothing else from this talk tonight, is technology can be wonderful, but we have to be careful with age-appropriate technology. Because, again, in the same way that, how many of you love your automobiles, right? But you don't give your 5-year-old the car keys because these are powerful technologies that can't just be given to 5-year-olds because they're not developmentally ready enough for those yet. And we haven't been fully aware as to how adversely some of our kids are being affected. And now when we're looking at why are our kids so unwell, why are they so depressed, why are they so anxious, why are they so self-harming at record levels that they never had, there's a relationship to some of this. So, this is a real feel-good beginning to this talk.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When you say kids, what age were you focusing on?
The younger, the more impactful. So the younger the kid, the more impactful the effect can be. So a 2-year-old is going to be more impacted than a 20-year-old. So younger tends to be more problematic. So, say that again?
I just got back from the shirt, and there was not one kid at the airport, not one kid on the airplane, as young as 6 months old, 7 months old.
I saw now they had a newborn baby rocker, newborn like the day out of the womb, and this rocker had a screen 6 inches away from the infant's face because, this idea is that we have to keep, there's a narrative, there's a Kool-Aid that we've all been sold that, from baby Einstein to we live in the digital age and nobody wants to feel that their kid's going to be, we want our kids to have a leg up. And so, there's a narrative that we want our kids to get acclimated to technology pretty early because they'll be behind in our digital world. But, we have to know that not only did Steve Jobs, if some of you may have heard this, Steve Jobs didn't let his kids have iPhones, but Sergey Brin and Larry Page, the Google boys, no tech when they were kids and teenagers. They were Montessori students. Jeff Bezos, some of you may have heard of him, rich guy, Amazon. No technology until he was 17. He was a Montessori student. So some of the most powerful brains in technology had really traditional hand-eye play, creative play, no screen childhoods. And that's what really unleashed the power of their minds, because if Jeff Bezos might have had that baby rocker screen, we probably wouldn't have Amazon today, which would probably be a good thing. But he wouldn't, they wouldn't have reached their potential if they were, because what this is it stunts things. If nothing else, this stunts cognitive development, interpersonal development, and we'll talk a little bit about how that happens. So again, I'm not saying everybody go home and throw your phones into the lake. What I'm saying is be careful with the age-appropriate unleashing of the digital hounds, because it will have an impact on your child's development. Some, the kids that can tend to be more impacted might also have some underlying issues. So if your child might already have some issues, if there's some spectrum issues, if there's some, what we would call comorbid issues already with underlying depression or anxiety or some childhood issues, and you add screen time, you can make things quite a bit more complicated or worse. So I was teaching at Stony Brook. I was working Riverhead School District, and I was in private practice. And I first entered this world of screen time and what it might be doing. My specialty was treating substance addiction. So I was also working at the rehab in Greenport, and I'd done some other substance addiction work. And a 16-year-old kid was sent to my office, and this had to be, 12, 14 years ago. And they didn't know what was happening with him. He was having what seemed like a psychotic episode. So 16-year-old, I write about this in Glow Kids. It's the opening part of Glow Kids. He's got a Metallica t-shirt on. He's in my office. He's totally dissociating. He's looking around. He's blinking. He's not sure where he is. I keep asking him, do you know where you are? What's your name? I'm asking him grounding questions. what's your name? And he looked like he was either high on acid or some kind of dissociating effect he was having. Didn't know where he was, confused. After a few minutes of that, I finally got him to kind of look, and he looked me in the eyes and he said, "Are we still in the game?" And I said, "No, we're not still in the game." And then I talked to him a little bit more, and he had been playing World of Warcraft for 12 to 14 hours a day for multiple days in a row. So it was sleep deprivation and hyper-realism screen immersion. And he had essentially what we might call video game psychosis, where he didn't know where the game ended and reality began. And so he was in the Matrix. He was in the Matrix, and he didn't know if I was part of the Matrix. He didn't know he got sent actually to, this was sort of a mistake, but he got sent to, not Stony Brook, to Mather Hospital, and he got hospitalized for a month, and they put him on antipsychotic meds. He was not genuinely psychotic. He was sleep deprived and screen immersed. If he would have gotten 2 good nights sleep and unplugged for 3 or 4 days, he would have been fine. He came out 30 days later on antipsychotic meds and, misdiagnosed with all sorts of more problematic things, but he had no family history of mental illness. He had no personal history of mental illness. He just had, as I said, this intersection of sleep deprivation and screen immersion in this escapist fantasy world that he was in. So that was my first, oh wow, I've never seen this before. What he was experiencing was called derealization. And derealization is when you don't know, like the word says, what's real. And we see derealization with substance abuse, right? So crystal meth psychosis, the bad acid trip, those folks have derealization. They don't know they're hallucinating. I'd never seen screen-induced derealization before. And that was my first sort of aha moment, where then the more I started researching this subject and the more I started looking into some of these effects, I started, the doors opened up of, wow, this is a brave new world that we're entering, and some of these effects are new, some of these impacts are pretty profound, and we better sort of catch up with what's happening, because we're in this world quickly, because it feels like we've always been in the digital world, but when you think about it, the iPhone was 2007, the iPad was 2010, TikTok was 2016. I mean, this is all recent stuff. I mean, from an evolutionary standpoint, it's just been 10 to 15 years that we've been fully in this digital age. So, I mean, we've changed as a species pretty dramatically in a very short period of time. And part of what I write about is evolutionarily, we haven't really caught up. We're not really prepared for this kind of sedentary, screen-staring, isolated, meaning-devoid life. We're meant to be more physically active. We're meant to be social face-to-face. We're meant to be to live quite a bit differently than what the screen age has done to us. And so that's why we're seeing some of these physical and psychiatric outcomes that we're seeing. So, all right, so I've been a little heavy here for a couple minutes. I'm going to release things. I'm going to show you a quick video from Paula Poundstone. Some of you may know she's a comedian. She still performs almost every weekend out of the year. She's become a friend of mine in this cause. But she was on CBS News a couple years back, and this is a 2-minute video where she talks about, this is her kind of take on screen time and our kids. And the reason why she's such a powerful advocate is, and she's open about this, so I'm not betraying any trust. She had a really, really hard time with one of her 3 kids with screen time. I mean, really a hard time. And I won't go into those details, but that made her a parent warrior about raising the alarms about what can happen with some of our more problematic screen experiences.
Almost everyone in our country is addicted to electronics and riddled with denial. When I talk to people about it, they get defensive. They say it's not addiction, it's just something they enjoy. Really? I love to play ping pong. I love to practice the drums. I love to tap dance, but I have never even once tried to figure out how to do any one of those things while driving in such a way as that the cops couldn't see. Because I am not addicted to those activities, I just enjoy them. And there's a huge difference. Screen devices wreak havoc with the brain's frontal lobe. Diagnoses of ADHD in our children have taken a steep rise since the proliferation of screen devices. Yet, even when presented with that information, parents often won't hear of protecting their kids from the harmful effects of screen devices. Kids love them, they say. Yes, they do. And some kids would love heroin if we gave it to them. I'm told that after the initial vomiting stage, it can be a hoot. We didn't know this when we first brought these shiny new toys into our homes, but now we do know. Still, adults aren't doing anything about it. Why? Because we're addicted. Addiction hampers judgment. You see it. Everywhere you look, people are staring at their flat things. We're terrified of being bored. No one drifts or wonders. If Robert Frost had lived today, he would have written, "Whose woods are these? I think I'll Google it." Screens are tearing away our real connections. Ads for family cars show every family member on a different device. Applebee's, Chili's, Olive Garden, and some IHOPs are putting tablets on their tables. These restaurants claim they're providing tablets just to make ordering easier. Well, gee, if saying, "May I please have chicken fingers," is too difficult for our young ones, wouldn't we want to work on that? The tech industry has profited from the "every child must have a laptop in the classroom" push, but education hasn't. Research shows that the brain retains information better read from paper than from a screen. And students who take notes by hand are more successful in tests than those who type their notes on a computer. Yet art, music, sports, play, healthy meals, and green space, things we know help the developing brain, are on the chopping block of school districts' budgets annually. Even knowing this, at the suggestion that we get screen devices out of our classrooms and away from our children, people gasp. But they'll need them for the world of the future. Our children will need fully functioning brains for the world of the future. Let's put that first.
Okay. So before I talked about some of the mental health impacts, so these are just some of the statistics that are, again, on fire. Things are getting progressively worse, especially post-COVID, in terms of increase in depression rates, suicide rates for kids. Girls aged 10 to 14 have a suicide rate increase of 131%. Young adults who use social media are 3 times more likely to suffer from depression. And on and on. It's the research is clear on this. But some of the ones that I want to focus in on, this is pretty recent. This was a CDC report from 2023. The bottom square I'd like you to focus on, nearly 1 in 3, this is teenage girls, seriously considered attempting suicide. Not just suicidal ideations, but had serious thoughts about suicide. It's up from 60% from 10 years ago. These are not insignificant around the margin statistics. These are pretty significant. And the one that I want you to focus on here, well, not only is the CDC found that suicide rates for kids aged 10 to 14 have doubled from 2007 to 2014. Suicides have overtaken motor vehicle accidents as a cause of death in that age group. But this bottom square, so if you're on your device for 5 hours or more daily, as opposed to 1 hour or less, you're 70% more likely to want to kill yourself. And it's suicidal thoughts or actions. So think about that. Just being in front of a screen for 5 hours versus 1 hour makes you 70% more likely to want to kill yourself. And so the question that begs asking is it the medium? Is it the content? Is it both? Yeah. Yeah, and you can get the slides. You'll have access to the slides, but yeah, feel free to. So we have to ask ourselves these questions. Yeah.
When you talk about screen time, is it specific to social and games and?
Great question. Yeah. So not all screen time is created equal, right? So there are some that are worse than others. So if we think of screen time as a continuum, like we would think of sometimes with like substance use, it's not an exact analogy, but cannabis isn't the same as crystal meth, right? They all have sort of problematic potential. So at the less impactful end of screen time, you might have things like pro-social usage or, more benevolent forms of, even baby Einstein is problematic. And my colleague of mine, Dr. Christakis, does ADHD research, and he shows even baby Einstein is problematic. But it's certainly not as problematic as Grand Theft Auto. And it's certainly not as problematic as some of the social media influencer content that can be not only brain altering, but mind shaping, because it's the medium and it's the content. So, it's just staring at a screen, because so the two biggest drivers of depression, or two big drivers of depression, are being physically sedentary and isolated. And think about what screen time is. Screen time is you're sitting in a chair, sedentary, and you're not usually watching screens in a group, you're usually isolated. So just being sedentary and isolated is going to increase your likelihood of depression. Now factor in the content, body image issue stuff, influencer, I'm better than you type of stuff. We call it the social comparison effect, which we'll talk about. Now the content is amplifying the effect. So the medium itself is problematic, but the content makes it even more. And so some content is more, TikTok videos about go kill yourself are going to be much more impactful than watching Bambi. So that's a great question. And there tends to be a bit of a gender divide. Young males tend to gravitate towards gaming, digital escapism platforms, I call them, and young females tend to gravitate towards social media, but obviously not mutually exclusive. Obviously, there's overlap in both. Yeah.
So the last box there, where you talked about the 5 hours or more on screen.
Right.
Yes, you're talking about the interactiveness or social, et cetera, but, the kids today are on a good sedentary, a good portion of their day in a school day using an actual screen.
Right.
Versus the teacher teaching to
Right.
them like we had growing up.
Right.
So I know it's not all equal, whether they're playing Grand Theft Auto or whether they're watching Instagram. But if I'm having that kind of interaction with the screen where it's sedentary as opposed to you speaking to me and us having an
Sure.
interactive discussion, is that also part of that 5 hours that we would count?
Yeah, so we're not delineating between recreational screen time versus educational screen time, right? Just because it's the same thing as I would say, just because a medication is prescribed to you, doesn't mean it won't have a negative effect because it's prescribed as opposed to not prescribed. Your brain, the child's brain doesn't delineate, well, I'm in school, so this screen time is not going to be somehow different because I'm in a classroom setting as opposed to being in my bedroom. So it's problematic, and you're right. That's part of what I'm trying to raise awareness about with schools is that we need that Socratic dialectic, that face-to-face interactive learning, because screen-based learning, and I'll go into it a little bit too, a little bit further on, isn't without its downsides. The kid's brain does not delineate screen time. And I think many evolved educators like you have here are beginning to understand that the kids need interactive play and they need face-to-face education, not, the narrative had been for a lot of, big tech was trying to sell, I speak at education conferences and a lot of superintendents buy into the narrative that we have to meet the kids where the kids are. And so if the kids are on screens today, we have to teach them, we have to gamify the classroom. That's even the phrase that's used a lot, gamifying the classroom. Because so many of the kids are gamers, if something's not in game format, the child won't respond to it. Because now they've been so habituated to being stimulated all the time that now a teacher lecturing at the front of the class is like that Charlie want teacher, and unless we have bells and whistles, the idea is that the kid can't pay attention, and oftentimes they can't because we've created an ADHD profile. I mean, ADHD rates have skyrocketed because we've overstimulated infants where they become stimulation dependent. The developing brain, when a child is 18 months, 2 years old, 3 years old, they need to use their active imagination and do they need to play make-believe. And that's when they're creating neurosynaptic pathways of creativity. That's where they're delaying gratification. But a child that's 18 months old that's getting overly stimulated with screen time, you're baking in an ADHD profile. And Dr. Christakis is the researcher at the University of Washington. He's done all that ADHD screen research. And his research, and there's a slide that I have about it, but it shows that so back in the 90s, for television, it was every hour of screen time that a 2 to 6-year-old was on front of a TV set, there was a 10% higher rate of ADHD. So if a 3-year-old was watching 3 hours of TV, he had a 30% higher rate of ADHD. They did that same research in 2010 with interactive iPads, and that was exponentially higher, the numbers. So the more overstimulated you would do, that pivotal developmental window for attention is ages 2 to 6. So if you're dropping a tablet in the crib for those children, all you're doing is you're priming them for attentional problems. And their brains, and we'll talk about why that creates this impulsivity profile. And then that, a lot of these things, we talk about, you can reverse some of these effects with this neuroplasticity, but some of these things can become lifelong, where it's hard to unring that bell. Like for example, language, right? Language there's a developmental window for language. Typically if you don't learn language between the ages of 2 and 10 or 12, you become a lifelong compromised language acquiring person. Like they've done studies with feral children. kids that were raised in the wild, if they weren't exposed to language during that key developmental window, lifelong they were able to learn words, but never metaphors or idiomatic speech. They were really, that part of their brain never really developed because they didn't get exposed to language when they needed to. The same thing with kids and attention. When our kids need to be learning their ability to attend, to focus, if they're just getting overly stimulated, that window begins to close. And then all of a sudden now, you have the kids who are bouncing off the walls. My son can't sit still, but the only time he can sit still is when he's staring at a screen. Because the screen has the hypnotic effect. But absent the screen, Johnny's jumping all over the place because they were too stimulated at too early of an age, and now it's hard to unring that bell.
And the problem is that the adults don't necessarily want to take on that challenge of unringing that bell, because we've got kids working on the classroom, so we'll just put on a lesson, on a Chromebook, on groups, some games.
Well, all of you in here, I think, know it's a lot easier to use the digital babysitter, right? If you're going on a long trip, put the TV on, the sedation effect is strong, right? If you want, if you have a child that can be a little disruptive, if you put them in front, if you drop the screen there, it will have that sedating effect. It's a lot harder to be a tech-cautious parent. It takes more work and more effort. But I'm suggesting that the reward is there because as much as it's easier to lead into, oh God, let's face it, look, we're parents, we work, we're exhausted, we're tired. Sometimes it's just easier to give our kids a tablet to kind of keep them engaged and quiet. But there's a price to pay. There's a price to pay for that. So, as I was saying, which has led to what we're talking about here, the zombie apocalypse. You've all seen that tribe. It's the head down, alone together, kids who are together yet not really together. And so we essentially have an entire generation that's reaching out, crying for help, looking for some kind of support. And some of the flavors of what we're talking about can be really interesting. I want to show you one more brief video. This is, I was involved about 4 months ago in a documentary called Doom Scroll, and you're going to see some really interesting insights from a couple of researchers, and then you're going to see the woman up there who's crying with a mama cap on. She was an upstate New York Potsdam mom who had an adolescent son who was sex-exploited and had a really bad outcome, so we're going to hear a little bit from her. So these are just part of the new challenges in the new digital age that we're in, so I'll let the video speak for itself, and then we'll go from there. This isn't out yet. This is a trailer from the documentary that
2017, UT Austin ran a really interesting study on the impact of where your phone is located and how that impacts cognitive performance. They had folks come into the lab, random phone, never had a SIM card in it, it's just a prop. Power that smartphone down, take a battery of different cognitive assessments, a number of different conditions. Phones outside, in the waiting room, turned off. Phones in the room with them, still off, and put them in their bag. And then they had them take their phone out, still off, put it on the desk, just off to the side. They can see it, but it's just there, off, like a prop. As the phone went from being outside of the room to being in a pocket or a bag, being on the desk, scores linearly decrease, working memory, how intelligent you are. All these different cognitive assessments consistently, linearly plummet. The mere presence of the smartphone, even if it's turned over, even if it's off, reduce your performance. I'm not paying attention to it, it's not doing anything. This is not just a phone.
The average 13 to 18-year-old in the United States, they're spending 8 hours and 39 minutes per day looking at screens non-productively. I have personally seen iPhone screen time reports from college students spending 16 hours a day on their phone in the middle of the semester. So I decided to look at how much time does an 18-year-old actually have left. So we'll be optimistic here. For an 18-year-old, if they're going to live to 90 years old, they've got 864 remaining months. About 1/3 of those will be spent asleep, about 126 of those months actively working, about 18 of those months driving, 36 cooking and eating, 36 doing chores and errands, about 27 in the bathroom. So that leaves roughly 334 months, optimistically, for everything else in life. What deserves the largest chunk of that remaining free time? All the boxes that you want to tick on your bucket list, the people that you love and want to spend time with, all of that has to come out of those 334 months. But if we take the average amount of time that a 13 to 18-year-old in the United States is currently spending looking at screens non-productively, they're on pace to spend about 93% of their remaining free time looking at a screen non-productively. I have never shown a kid this graphic and had them say that TikTok is the thing that deserves the largest chunk of their remaining free time.
All of these things that you would never see out in any other media are completely allowed to be on these social media sites unchecked. Riley has big life ambitions. He played football, basketball, lacrosse. He accepts a friend request at 9:30 in the morning by these people from the Ivory Coast, posed as this beautiful young girl. They then get him to send a picture. So he sends a genital picture back to them. The extortion begins. Send us $3,500 or we'll send this to everybody that you know. The picture gets sent to everyone with the same last name as him. Sure enough, the brother and sister and all the cousins with the same last name had a message that said, "I know Riley." And then Riley got a message that said, "See what I can do." He says, "Leave me alone. Why are you doing this to me? Please stop, and I'll kill myself." And they just don't stop. He found the gun cabinet key. Riley shot himself. It's so hard to have everything that you were going to be together taken away. I just left him a couple hours ago. My beautiful, happy, vibrant boy. Like, what could have possibly happened? His case was turned over to the FBI. Everybody has Facebook and Instagram, right? Everybody's still kind of fooled into thinking that it's okay, that it's safe.
Many Silicon Valley parents, including industry leaders, strictly limit the technology used for their own children.
The Apple founder actually would not let his own kids play with computers.
Industry giants like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, who restricted their own kids' access to technology at home.
As the generation of people who have only ever experienced social media like this grow up, we're going to lose sight of what reality was before.
I've been doing this work for a long time. I'm seeing some grassroots awakenings.
This is something that is affecting every family. Working age adults, people in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s.
What are parents supposed to do? What are schools supposed to do?
We have to use it just to survive.
A landmark study is looking into how addictive smartphones may be and how they impact your brain.
This documentary is conducting the largest study on digital detox that's ever been done.
Targeting over 500 participants, bring them into the lab, baseline them, every measure of stress, anxiety, depression, the full mental health gamut, as well as cognitive performance. What's their attention span, their working memory?
What does it look like if you give me the first 30 minutes of your day phone free and give me the last 30 minutes of your day before sleep phone free?
It's not too late. It's way worse than people think, and the problem is not going to fix itself.
But is it really effective or just another fad?
So yeah, a lot of information, and you know, when we filmed that documentary, we got a chance to meet that mother, and it was just heartbreaking. You know, again, the way she said it that morning. She left that morning, and all that sextortion and her son's suicide happened in the course of one day. So it's pretty horrific, some of the brave new world that we're in. So, you know, just to understand, you know, this was a fairly recent JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association study, and it looked at the brains of children between the ages of 3 to 5, and it found that those who used screens more than the recommended 1 hour a day without parental involvement had lower levels of development in the brain's white matter. And they were key to the development of language, literacy, and cognitive skills. And quote from the researcher, "This is the first study to document associations between higher screen use and lower measures of brain structure and skills in preschool-aged kids." So these effects start young, and they amplify as kids get older. This is important because the brain is developing the most rapidly in the first 5 years. We talked before about the brain being sponge-like, and these are when the windows of growth happen, and if we're not properly nurturing our kids, they're not going to get the optimal brain development. So how did we get here? This was a Newsweek cover story from back in 1996 rather, and you know, it's an optimistic Norman Rockwell-esque picture of the promise of technology. There's a kid smiling, happy with her laptop on her lap. We won't talk about the electromagnetic frequency effect and radiations and reproductive rates and what's happened with the radiation. I won't get into that part of it yet, or tonight. But it was an optimistic picture. Can PCs make your kid a better student? And then 16 years later, there was a very different cover story at Newsweek, and it was crazy, panic, depression, psychosis. We began to see what some of this screen love affair was doing to our most important commodity, our kids. In rough categories, you could break up some of these clinical effects into tech addiction, attentional disorders, increased aggression, mood disorders like depression and anxiety, and thought disorders like psychosis. And so when we talk about phone addiction, and any kind of addiction, some of you may know that the main neurotransmitter involved in any kind of addiction, substance or behavioral, is dopamine. And how things may increase your dopamine response, or what's called the dopamine reward loop, correlate with how potentially addictive something might be. So there was a study that was done way back in 1998 that looked at how dopaminergic, how dopamine activating certain substances and activities were. And for example, so food can raise your dopamine 50%. So we know that food can, some people could have issues with food. Sex is 100% dopamine activating. Cocaine is 350%. And crystal meth is 1,200% dopamine activating. That's why we tend to think of, in the substance world, crystal meth as one of the most highly addictive substances because it has such a dopamine activating effect. Well, back in 1998, they also tested video games. And video games, again, 1998 video games, which were not quite, you know, Pac-Man and Pong, but it wasn't quite Grand Theft Auto either, they were as dopamine activating as a sexual experience. So sex and gaming, 1998 games, were equally dopamine arousing. And again, we have to look at, you know, our 8-year-olds are playing some of these games, and so they're having these arousing experiences that they're just not neurophysiologically developed to handle yet. That's why when you tell your kid, I only want you playing your game for half an hour tonight, you're exposing them, you're asking them to set time constraints on something that is just so powerful for them, so neurologically overwhelming for them, they can't moderate that. Most adults have a hard time moderating that. A colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Doan, he's a researcher for he works for the Pentagon and the US Navy. He had looked at the gaming industry. The gaming industry, again, there's an intentionality behind the addiction. They know that if they can increase your adrenaline and increase your dopamine, and you can level up, the games become very habit-forming. And typically they'll get beta testers that will test different versions of games, and if your blood pressure doesn't spike to 180 over 140, they go back to tweak the game to have the adolescent beta tester get more of an arousing effect, because that's the end result. The end result is try to get that physiological arousal. Just so you see a brain imaging study, I want to show to you pretty clearly what happens to the brain of young gamers when they play violent video games. And this study, which was an Indiana University Medical School study, this just looked at 2 weeks. It looked at the brains of non-gamers who were asked to play violent video games for 10 hours a week. And 10 hours a week is, you know, those of you that have no gamers, like I treat gamers, that's like a walk in the park. It's a very nominal amount of time. What happens to those brains after 2 weeks of 10 hours of violent gameplay? And so what they found in this pre and post study of the brain, with Dr. Wang, the lead researcher, said, for the first time we found that randomly assigned young adults showed less activation in certain frontal brain regions. Again, the executive functioning, following a week of playing violent video games at home. The affected brain regions are important for controlling emotional and aggressive behavior, or otherwise impulsivity. Frontal brain regions are also the same brain regions that are affected by drug addiction. For the first time, researchers showed a direct relationship between playing violent video games and the subsequent changes in those regions of the brain. And what that looked like was this. The top 3 slides are the control group. So they didn't participate in any of the gaming. So for purposes of this brain imaging study, a lot of orange is good. Orange shows healthy activation. So before training, after 1 week, after 2 weeks, the brains of the non-gamers still showed healthy orange activation in their brain. When you look at the bottom 3 slides going from left to right, the bottom middle and bottom right, you see almost no orange. There's no activation in key parts of the brain after just 2 weeks. So the question is, what happens after 2 years, after 20 years, in terms of some of these neurophysiological effects? The US military, a friend of mine had made me aware of some of the research. They began to experiment with immersive interactive virtual reality games as a form of pain management. So a lot of combat veterans were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with IED burns. They were burned in combat. And some of you may know, if you're a burn victim, typically you might get a high doses of morphine to tolerate the burn treatment. If you're a burn victim, they have to do something what's called debridement, which is scraping off the dead skin. It's excruciatingly painful. You have to get high doses of morphine. Often you get addicted to the morphine. So they were looking for a non-pharmacological approach to pain management. And so these 2 researchers at the University of Washington said, what if we have these burn victim soldiers playing this virtual reality game? Can we treat their wounds without morphine? And this is what it looked like. This is one of the soldiers. He's playing, he's got the joystick in his hand, he's actually playing this game, and the nurse is treating his wounds. And this is a game, by the way. This game wasn't like some kind of creepy, nefarious game. This was called Snow World. They were throwing snowballs at these penguins. And so for my book, Locusts, I interviewed one of the first participants in the study, Lieutenant Sam Brown, and he told me, Dr. Kardaras, when they gave me morphine, it still hurt like shit when they treated me every day. When I was playing Snow World, I felt nothing. And when they did brain imaging research, they found that the part of the brain devoted to pain was more deadened while they were game playing than by actual morphine. So again, this is a great use of technology for pain management, but our kids are playing these games. What is it doing if it's so powerful that it's more powerful than morphine? Other effects are the HPA axis. It's basically the adrenal response when you're overly stimulating kids. The HPA axis is also known as your fight or flight response. So a lot of times when our kids are on their different platforms, they're in fight or flight mode. So they get not only dopamine activation, they get adrenal elevation. So as some of you may know, the fight or flight response was evolutionarily essential for us to survive as a species, because when we were back in the caveman days, we had to, when we saw threats, we had to activate our adrenal response. We had to get adrenaline flowing so we could run or we could fight. And our heart pumping and blood racing. But now what's happening is we're activating that adrenal response when folks are either getting overly stimulated with gaming or other social media platforms. So they go into this fight or flight mode and then they stay there for hours. And we weren't made evolutionarily to stay in fight or flight for hour after hour, day after day. So then you go into this adrenal fatigue mode where now these kids get dysregulated, where they're like so tweaked that all of a sudden they can't sleep, a lot of sleep dysregulation, they show up to school exhausted, they're often misdiagnosed with either some kind of sleep irregularities or ADHD. So it creates this whole dysregulation with our kids because they're just too overstimulated. And it's really hard to lower that adrenal thermostat once you've raised it. Before I mention some of the ADHD research by Dr. Christakis, I won't repeat this again. This is the guy that tested screen time in ADHD. And this research was pretty significant. One of the newer phenomena now is this intersection of FanDuels and our kids and, what's the word I'm looking for, fantasy leagues, which have now kind of morphed into like parlays and gambling. When I was coming out of college, I was a big sports fan, and I played a lot of sports, and I was a big sports fan. The NFL, NBA, and MLB, there was a firewall between gambling sites and professional sports. It was never the two shall cross. In fact, a lot of people, poor Pete Rose never got into the Hall of Fame because of his proclivity to gamble. But now our major sports are owned and supported and advertised by some of these betting companies. and they blur. Now, if you watch some of the commercials during the NFL they call it gaming instead of gambling. Game safely, and they'll have a little PSA, a public service announcement. And a lot of teenagers now are like beginning to parlay and gamble, and it's a sort of a conflation of fantasy leagues, and then begin to view it as sort of like a fantasy game, and then into betting. And a lot of the young clients that I've treated, there's a lot of cross-pollination. So I'll treat young men in my treatment program in Austin, where we treat 17 to 30-year-olds. But they'll come in for gaming, but then there's excessive porn, or they'll morph into gambling, or it's the whack-a-mole theory of addiction. People will then switch addictions from one to another if they get primed for certain types of rewards, certain types of dopamine rewards. And according to this, young people are significantly at higher risk of developing gambling disorder than adults, in part because their brains are not fully developed. Their ability to evaluate risk, their ability to handle loss isn't as secure as an adult. Dr. Timothy Fallon, co-director of the UCLA Gambling Studies program, told ABC News. I believe they're targeting the young, said Schneider, who is also a national board member of Stop Predatory Gambling. They want the next generation. They label it gaming because now it's a game that they go on and do that. It's really gambling. That's what I was talking about, sort of conflating the two, gaming and gambling. There's been a lot of research on the increased aggression effect, and I won't get into this in detail, but there's been a significant amount of research that if you're playing first-person shooter games or violent digital media, the effect on the individual is increased aggression. It's a stimulant, right? So if any one of us were to go have 3 double Starbucks lattes and then you go driving, are you more likely or less likely to get into a road rage episode? Well, if you're taking a stimulant, it raises your adrenal thermostat. You're more likely to get into kind of a reactive or potentially aggressive situation. I've worked with law enforcement on a couple of cases that were pretty horrific, but there's a lot of extremist groups that are targeting our adolescents through online platforms. The low-hanging fruit for a lot of these extremist groups are the lonely teenage boy. That is like the target for so many, whether it's left-wing extremism or Islamic extremism or right-wing extremism. They're trying to target the lonely young male who's looking for a team to belong to. Because let's face it, everyone wants to feel a sense of connection, a sense of belonging. If you're the outlier in your class, if you don't feel a sense of belonging, they are predatorily targeted on 4chan, on gaming platforms, and a variety of different networks. And this was one of the cases. I worked on this case. I was an expert witness on Corey Johnson, who was a Palm Beach County adolescent who had been, bullied and a loner and into politics, and had started when he was 16 as a left-wing progressive liberal. And he was a YouTuber, so he would watch YouTube videos all the time. And so they were politically tinted, so his feed would keep sending him the content that, like the way our feeds work, the algorithm sends us what it thinks we want to see. And so he would get political content, but then one time he watched a short YouTube video about the Holocaust. And because he saw that, he started getting Holocaust denying videos, and he started getting white supremacy videos. So he went, in about 6 months' time, he went from being a progressive liberal to a white supremacist. But that wasn't the end of the story. This kid, this empty shell of a kid who didn't have a core identity, then he happened to watch a documentary about Syria and Assad. And because he watched that, he started getting ISIS content. And then he started getting ISIS recruitment videos. And the investigators, the law enforcement folks, they showed me some of the videos that he was targeted with. You would be amazed at how high the production values are, how sophisticated and polished these recruitment videos were. If I didn't know better, if I was a lost, lonely teenager and I was watching some of these recruitment videos, it looked pretty attractive. So ISIS was putting out 5 videos a day in 5 different languages, and they made ISIS seem like Shangri-La. It was, join ISIS and you're going to be, saving communities and building wells and being a leader in your, it made ISIS sound like the best thing since sliced bread. So these, I hate to say it, not overly bright, lonely kids gravitated towards because he wanted to feel like he belonged. And eventually he got brainwashed. He committed a very horrific crime. He essentially decapitated, it says there that he stabbed the 13-year-old, he decapitated this 13-year-old boy and tried to kill 3 other people in this psychotic, brainwashed rage. And you know, when I testified at his case, when I came back home and I told my wife, what was really the most unsettling thing for me was I had to do an assessment for this young man when he was in maximum security in Florida, and I thought, because I'd seen the crime scene photos, they were horrific, so I thought I'm going to meet a sociopath. I'm going to meet a totally little Charles Manson sociopath. And I was shocked at how normal this kid was, because he had been in prison. This was through COVID now, so he had been waiting for his trial about 9 months, sitting in maximum security, so he had no social media, no YouTube, no TV. He had kind of landed back to the nice kid that he used to be. And so when I met this kid in this little conference room in prison, hello, sir, thank you for visiting me. Would you like to sit down? This meek, sweet, nice kid. And I'm trying to wrap my mind around how he could have committed the crimes that I had seen that he had done. And you know, we walk through it. Okay, let's start from the beginning, from when you were 5 years old to what happened to the night of the crimes. And it was amazing to see how quickly a young person that's impressionable can be so brainwashed and so fall down the rabbit hole of violence. Not dissimilar to some of our school shooters, not dissimilar to some of our incels, you know, young, impressionable, empty people looking for a cause, looking for some kind of belonging, and they're not getting those needs met in their real life world, and they're finding it in some of this predatory indoctrination. So those threats are out there too. These are the Columbine boys, Klebold and Harris. These guys became patient zero. These were the first digital age school shooters. Before these guys, the only other school shooting was the 1966 Austin UT Tower shooter. He was a young Marine with traumatic brain injury who killed 14 or 15 people in 1966. Fast forward to Klebold and Harris, 1998, I believe it was. And then after them, copycat after copycat after copycat. And now we live with school shooting realities because of the social contagion effect that can happen when something goes viral, essentially. Klebold and Harris have become role models, digital role models for the angry, lost, lonely, you know, the young profile of a young person. And I've had to assess some of these young men who feel disempowered, and they're going to leave their mark. They're going to have their 15 minutes of infamy. And these two created the blueprint. And it wasn't about guns, because initially they were going to blow up the school, but then they got access to guns and they did whatever they did that way. But as John Cohen from the Department of Homeland Security said, these school shootings, we find that Columbine seems to be an incident that school shooters look at. It seems to resonate with individuals that have the behavioral characteristics for this type of attacker. They go online, they look at past attacks in a perverse way, they connect with not only past incidents, but past attackers. And unfortunately, that's what we've seen. Social media, we've talked a little bit about briefly, has not only a severe, the main thing to know about social media, the main reason why it drives depression rates up, or self-harm rates also, is something called the social comparison effect. And the social comparison effect is basically, you know, historically when we grew up, we would compare ourselves to our friends. If you were in the lunchroom in your high school, you would compare yourself to that table or that table. Now, our kids have a lot more people to compare themselves to. There's influencers, there's thousands of followers, and so there's this mirroring effect where now, because what do people tend to post on social media? They don't post, this is me having a terrible day. They post their externalized, idealized selves. This is my amazing life. Here's me in my private jet. Half of it, 99% of it is fictitious or glamorized. But yet if you're having a rough day, a rough year, a rough life, and all you keep seeing is these externalized fantastic lives, it makes you feel worse and worse and worse about your own life. Because now you start thinking, well, maybe my life isn't all I thought it was, because look at all these wonderful, amazing human beings that I'm comparing myself to. So there's that aspect. And before I mentioned the Facebook whistleblower, this is Frances Haugen. She worked at Meta, and she was the one that testified before Congress, went on 60 Minutes, and she said, I have the emails, I have the data. We had done our own research at Meta, And our research showed that Instagram was increasing suicide rates for teenage girls. And the email said, should we change the algorithm? Hell no, it's going to reduce engagement. Classic example of profit over people. And she went public with it, and of course then Zuckerberg does his annual pilgrimage to Congress and says, we'll do better and we'll try to fix it, but they're not going to do better until they get forced to do better by some of these class action lawsuits that are currently happening. Social media tends to really drive some of those issues. I mentioned before social contagion effects. This is the new phenomenon also that I'm treating a lot in our treatment program in Austin. Young males and more females that have, we've all heard of the influencers that are like the Kardashian types of influencers or the Kylie Jenners. Yeah, they influence people with junk values, let's call it materialism. But then you have now psychiatric influencers who are really prominent. So you have influencers right now who are on TikTok with borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, dissociative identity disorder, Tourette's disorder, who are getting billions of views. And these psychiatric influencers are now, we're seeing that their symptoms are being mimicked by their followers. The one that got a lot of notoriety was TikTok Tourette's. And this was written up in Rolling Stone and a bunch of the national media. So there was 3 influencers, 3 women that were TikTok Tourette's influencers. And they had Tourette's disorder, excuse my imperfect pantomiming of a twitch. And so all of a sudden, 3-4 years ago, adolescent teenage girls throughout the United States who were following these Tourette's influencers started twitching. And that was odd, their pediatrician said, because Tourette's disorder tends to be 3-to-1 male to female, and it tends to be diagnosed in early childhood. It almost never happens that a teenage girl gets Tourette's disorder in high school. Yet all these couple of thousand teenage girls were now beginning to twitch, just like their influencers were. So consciously or unconsciously, we were seeing sort of a mimicking of some of these psychiatric symptoms. And again, think about if you're in the mindset of a vulnerable or insecure teenage girl, and what does social media teach us about values? What's valued in the world of social media? Followers, likes, views. That's the coin of the realm. So if you're feeling less than or empty and you see that some influencer has 2 billion views, well, now that gives it value. And whether you're consciously mimicking them or unconsciously mimicking them, that's what we were seeing. So in my treatment program in Austin, we were seeing young women coming in with all sorts of, I would call them aspirational psychiatric disorders that were mimicked from some of the social world that they were living in. They were living in this digital TikTok, YouTube world where they were self-diagnosing themselves and mimicking some of the psychiatric symptoms. And the reason why we could tell that they were mimicked, because when we do a digital detox, they're off of their computers for 6 weeks, the symptoms went away. They were only shown the symptoms when they were exposed to social media. If you really have something like borderline personality disorder, it doesn't go away in 4 weeks. So it told us, some of the clinicians that were working with some of these young people, that they didn't really have these disorders. They were showing signs of these disorders because they were being influenced and shaped by their influencers. So that's the digital social contagion effect. I'd written an op-ed for Time Magazine before COVID about warning about screens in classrooms, pedagogical effects. I'm going to kind of wrap it up in the last couple minutes here. They did a study, and this was the London School of Economics, that showed what happens if you remove phones from the classroom. I know we have the educators here. Test scores go up, amazingly enough. So test scores went up, so 40,000 students' phones were removed, and test scores went up 6% across the board, but for special needs students and students from poor socioeconomic backgrounds, their test scores went up 14%, because those kids were more influenced by the distraction of phones. So you remove the phones, you remove the distraction. And the bottom square was the quote from the researchers. The results suggest that low-achieving students are more likely to be distracted by the presence of mobile phones, while high achievers can focus in the classroom regardless of whatever phones are present. Banning mobile phones could be a low-cost way for schools to reduce educational inequality. Different studies, but Finland, for example, Finland's always at the top of the food chain in terms of educational standards. They removed portable devices from the classroom. Now other countries such as France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Greece have also removed phones from the classroom. Education psychologists have studied this. Patricia Greenfield from UCLA, she looked at over 50 studies that looked at technology in the classroom, and they found studies show that reading develops, that basically what they found was the more technology you have, the more technology use goes up, the more love of reading goes down. And why that's really crucial is because there were 2 huge studies that showed that love of reading and reading competency correlated the most closely with successful outcomes as adults. So if we have something that reduces kids' love of reading, and we have all this research that says love of reading is such a key ingredient to their lifelong success, we're dropping this nuclear bomb on kids that's making them not like to read. And if you think about why that is, well, think about why that is. If any of you watch a high-octane action movie, think Liam Neeson in Taken, or think some Marvel movie. You watch 4 or 5 hours of that, high-octane action movie, car chase after car chase, and now I give you the book War and Peace. Now go read War and Peace. Oh. You've raised the octane level, and it makes the countervailing activity too boring. So we're overstimulating our kids. It makes it makes reading really boring, and reading is so important for their success, and yet we're exposing them to all these other activities that makes them not want to read, and to their detriment. And we also know that reading on screens versus on paper is different. Anne Magin is a reading researcher from Norway. She found that when you read the same content on paper versus a glowing screen, the retention rates are 20% less. Same content, and they attribute that to something called the topography of the page. When you look at a page, there's a north, east, south, and west, and so when you're reading something and you have to recall it, you're like, oh yeah, you visualize kind of where on the page you saw it, but how many of you read something on the scroll, and you're scrolling, and after a while you get disoriented, and you don't know if you've read 3 pages or 30 pages. It can be really disorienting because you don't have those landmarks to kind of help you recall what you've been reading or to help you process that. So that's the downsides of even reading on screens. Is not ideal. This talks about some of the research that talks about how screen time destroys the love of reading. I don't want to belabor that because we just went into it. I mentioned before how Steve Jobs didn't let his own kids have screens. His biographer said every evening Steve made a point of having dinner at the big long table in their kitchen discussing books and history and a variety of things. No one ever pulled out an iPad or a computer. So the solution, those of you that are here saying, God, this is also depressing, what do we do as a community, as family members, as parents? I talk about trying to build our kids' psychological immune system, because we're not going to go back to Amish. We're just not. So, you know, a metaphor that I like to use is that the water is going to be turbulent, but we have to make our kids better swimmers. So how do we make our kids better swimmers? Sports and music and face-to-face activities and community support, all the things that, these are the things that can be protective factors from things that can hopefully help them not get sucked into some of the digital rabbit holes that we've talked about before. But intrinsic sense of identity, resilience, strong real-life social supports. Values are important. I know they're third rail. Sometimes we can't talk about values in public schools, but in that values void, oftentimes other more toxic values can fill that void. One of the best things you can do as parents is delay, because an ounce of delay prevention is worth a pound of treatment cure. It's really hard to treat this once it's gone too far, but it's really easier to manage. If, you know, there's a movement now called Wait Until 8th, and it's parents who are waiting until 8th grade before they give their children any kind of devices or phones, because that gives your kid a little bit more developmental time before they are forced to navigate with their device. Be models, practice what you preach. You can't tell your kids no screen time when you're, you know, lulled by your own device. Not only because social learning theory says you're teaching your child that the screen time is important, but you're also not giving your child quality attention if your attention is split yourself. If you're got one eye on your own computer or your own phone as you're kind of not fully present for your own child, they don't get that full attachment and that full connection that they need from you. No screens at the dinner table is a really great suggestion. One day a week, try to do a digital fast with your families where you all do something active together that's not screen-based. Talk to your kids about some of these issues. What I find to be really effective is, no teenager likes to be told what to do. Stop telling me my phone's no good, or you're going to take away my phone. But what I found to be really effective is, who's really telling you what to do, Mr. Teenager? Is big tech. They're manipulating you, they're monetizing you, they are treating you worse than, forget, I'm your parent, I love you, but do you know what these companies are doing to exploit you? And then I have that response, I use this in treatment often, when you show 19-year-olds or teenagers how, like The Social Dilemma is an excellent documentary that shows how big tech manipulates young people. That's when you have young people saying, hell no, I don't want to be part of this experiment of manipulation. So talk to your kids often and early, try to foster balanced, resilient empathy, hobbies like sports, art, and music. Allow your kids to be bored. We're the ones that are uncomfortable with our kids being bored. For some reason, I don't know why, we feel that we have to entertain our kids constantly, but a bored kid has to then use their active imagination, and then they play make-believe. And playing make-believe, as I said earlier, is the most healthy, neurosynaptically developing activity your kids can do. Let your kids be bored. Be comfortable with their discomfort. Don't feel that you have to entertain your kids with a song and dance. I'm not going to show this clip. I was on the Dr. Phil show, and they had 3 young people that were struggling. Not that were struggling. There was a 12-year-old that had committed suicide. There was a 17-year-old that had shot and killed his mother, and that shot his father in the face when his father took away his game platform. I forget his name right now. A young man had become addicted to gaming. His father took away his game box, locked it in the lock box where he also had his gun, and the young man committed matricide and almost patricide. And so the father was on the Dr. Phil show. The young man got sentenced to 24 years to life. And then there was the mother of a teenage girl who ran away from home and was living homeless in the tent in the shelter so she could have her phone. Because her mother took away her phone, she'd rather be homeless and have her phone than be at home without her phone. So these were 3 extreme cases that I worked on, and it was just, again, more examples of some of these issues. So we're living in complicated times. I'm going to wind it up by saying the best thing that we could do, as I said earlier, is delay. Because once you unleash the hounds, it's really hard to undo that. Once you've given your child a phone, and for those of you who have given your kids phones, no judgments. We're all doing what we think is best for our kids. You can reverse that. You can undo that just because maybe your child had already had a phone and you're reevaluating whether they should have that. But more importantly, it's to look at how is your phone affecting your child. Some kids have a better time of managing and moderating the usage. Other kids get really sucked in very deeply. So it's really kind of an individual case by case. There's no exact rule of how much screen time there's no universal rule. It's how dysregulated is your child getting when they're on their device and when they're getting off their device. And that's different for each child. If you're seeing your child is getting dysregulated from their phone or they get really activated, then it's time to either start pumping the brakes, maybe getting some therapy support, getting the child involved in some other activities. That's the best thing. I find doing a digital detox through the back door is most effective. Signing up your kids for camp, getting them involved in the sport, getting them a musical instrument, so you're backdooring some activity, so you're not just saying, we're doing this because social media is bad, your phone is bad, but you're just trying to get them engaged in other things so that they have a balance. So with that, I'm concluding this talk, and if you all have any questions or ripe tomatoes to throw at me, I'm open to any and all feedback here. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, we have a microphone, we can pass it around. I had a couple questions. I have 2 children, and they have iPads, and I've seen some of the sequelae you discussed, and I've actually, the past month, taken the iPad and how quickly can parents see improvement presented with from technology, and is there a point at which they're not going to recover? And the second question is, have you presented this data to adolescents and older children, and are they buying into the message that you're sending to them?
Yeah, so the first part of your question, so when you do a digital detox, typically we talk about a kid needs about, any human body needs about 4 to 6 weeks to go back to baseline. When you've been dysregulated in your adrenal system and dopamine, you need about 4 to 6 weeks to get back, to put the thermostat back to the baseline. The first 48 to 72 hours are when people get squirrely. So like when we do digital detoxes at my treatment program, where it's a residential 8-week program, it's the first 48 hours that you're going to have aggressive and explosive and temper tantrums, and then that kind of calms down. And then you get them busy with other activities. So you'll see huge improvements, and then in about a week to 2 weeks, it calms down, you can get engaged, and you start seeing the full potential of that young person back in about 3 to 4 weeks. So, but you know, most people have a hard time getting past that first 48 hours, because the first 48 hours is, you know, let's face it, you know, like those of you, we've done it with our kids, we're going to take, you know, there's an explosiveness that happens there, and if you're not willing to sort of push past that point of pushback, then, you know, what you're teaching is, okay, if I have a tantrum, I get what I need. As opposed to saying, I don't care how big of a tantrum we're going to have, this ain't happening, and this is what we're going to do, yell all you want. And then that tends to kind of dissipate. And yes, it's reversible. Yes, it's definitely reversible. All these things are fixable. And you know, my kids have been with me when I've given talks, so they've heard, they could probably do my presentation better than I can, but they're not immune. You know, we delayed giving them phones, and even though they got their phones in high school, we've still some issues with YouTube and some stuff that was, you know, we thought we were the most tech cautious parents, but it was not an absolute 100% successful experiment where we had this, you know, but they're athletes, they play music, their grades are, you know, so that, you know, people can have slight setbacks and still do really well. They were given a better shot at doing this as opposed to if, you know, at age 5 or 6 we, you know, just have at it with your screen. So it's a fight, you know, it's a struggle. It's hard to be a tech cautious parent. It takes a lot more effort. Any other questions or comments? Or?
I don't need the microphone.
Go ahead, shout it out.
Is there a way to, like, you spoke about algorithms and how they get to know you? With all the technology, AI, everything, there's got to be an app for that can block algorithms from tracking you. Like, is there something that can safeguard, say even Pinterest, like I myself use it, and I get bombarded with seeing stuff all the time. So like, is there something that can safeguard you and do so that they can't really run algorithms?
Is there an app that can block which part? Block?
The tracking part, that like what you said of that student that all of a sudden was getting ice and stuff, like it progressed. Like, is there something that can stop
So
it?
the Internet Safety Act is a law that's being proposed by Blumenthal in Connecticut and Blackburn in South Carolina, and that would allow families to opt out of algorithms. That law hasn't passed. There are apps that can, like Opal, can sort of block certain content, and then there's an app like Covenant Eyes that gives a daily report to what your husband, child, like with the daily usage report, and so it'll say like, okay, they weren't supposed to be on porn, they were on porn today, or they went on a gambling site, or so that doesn't block them, but it gives you, it's an accountability tool that lets you know what they've gone on. So there are some apps that are there that can block, and they could also give you some information as to where they're on, and they're helpful. They're helpful. I think, you know, I'm a therapist, so at the end of the day, I think it's better to get to the underlying problem so that you're less likely to want to lean into some of these activities. It's like saying somebody's an alcoholic. Do you just, you know, lock up the liquor cabinet, or do you work on the underlying issues that might want to make that person self-medicate with alcohol? So maybe address some of the other. So if your kid is feeling disempowered, lonely, bullied, depressed, trying to address those issues rather than saying apps bad, screens bad, because let's face it, these kids are pretty ingenious. They can get to it if they want to, so we have to kind of work on the underlying stuff, I think, to be the most effective. Yeah.
Are television screens safer than the phone?
Television screens?
For younger children, so you're trying to moderate what they're watching and you require them to watch television.
I do, for the reasons I said earlier, I do think televisions are, again, on this continuum of screen diet. I think they're part of they're more, because we talk about digital vegetables and digital candy. They're maybe not quite digital vegetables. Like Zooming with grandma might be what we call a healthy use of technology. Watching TV, and again, depending on the content, because you could be watching God knows what on, but it tends to be a little bit more. Now, I had a client in treatment who was a college student who, they were a Netflix binge watcher, and it was really interesting. He had a really interesting psychological profile. He felt really alone and didn't feel like he had a family that he belonged to, and so he would get really into these narrative, series. And so once he started, how Netflix, boom, you have to watch next episode. Once he got into the story, he would lose himself. He would be part of the family of the story that he would watch. So he would stay up round the clock, immersed in these marathon binges of whatever narrative show he was watching. And so for him, it was about finding a sense of connection and community where he didn't feel that he had to get it through this digital family that he would latch into when he would do Netflix binge watching. So that was on TV, and it was problematic for him, but typically we tend to think of TV being a little less problematic than other platforms. Yeah?
You had a good suggestion about limiting, if possible, screens until the age of 10, right? You don't get your iPhone until the age of 10. I have children that aren't quite there. My wife and I talked about when it is time for them to have phones, so we can seek out sort of a flip phone, right? Something that's really just for calls and texts. That seems like a good idea, but is there any data that you've experienced that might support or even defeat that conclusion when it comes to it?
Yeah, so there are phones, our sons, when they were in middle school, so they had Gab phones. So Gab phone, they weren't as stigmatizing as a flip phone, right? So you weren't like, oh my God, a flip phone. Right. So they looked like smartphones, but they weren't Wi-Fi compatible. So they could text, they could listen to music, and they could call. So they had, they could decoy their friends. They looked like they had a phone, but they weren't able to game or do social media on it. And there's a couple of other companies now too that have similar phones. They look like smartphones, but they don't have all the bells and whistles of a smartphone. So I recommend those as the training wheel phones for your kids if they're getting to that middle school age. Start them with those phones, and then see what happens as they move in through early adolescence and high school. But there's definitely 3 or 4. What was the other one? That was the other company that's on now. There's another one that's really out there now that's actually getting really popular, more popular than the Gab phone. The Wise phone, yeah, the Wise phone, the Wise phone, the Wise phone. Yeah, it's got some again, music and some stuff on it, but it definitely doesn't have the other radioactive stuff on it. That's problematic.
So therefore, in your opinion, it is the right way to sort of approach that path.
Yeah, because there's guardrails on those phones. So, because again, it's the old Japanese expression: the branch that doesn't bend breaks. If you're too rigid and your kid feels so, not part of the tribe, but then all of a sudden when they get the chance, they might overly rebel. So, it seemed to be a healthier way to kind of transition them into feeling like they could text their friends, but yet not necessarily be, being on social media 12 hours a day. Yeah.
Can you just talk briefly about the radiation piece and tips about whether phones in pockets or devices and protection that way? You said you weren't going to talk about it tonight.
Oh, about the radiation?
Yeah, can you just give a quick sprinkle?
There's a whole world of people that's all they focus on the problematic, the radiation effect is not insignificant. So there's research that shows that brain gliomas over the last, so brain cancer, brain gliomas are one of the most common brain gliomas. They take 10 years to metastasize. And there was the one UCLA neurologist who said, essentially, when you put your phone next to your head, it's the same frequency as a microwave oven, and it takes about 40 to 45 minutes for your neurons to start popping like popcorn. And so we're beginning to see ever-increasing spikes of brain cancer, glioma type cancer from phones next to the ear, fertility rates that have gone down with laptops, people so they've measured, and in fact, California, which has all these disclosure laws about their radiation effects, you'll see that they'll say that it's unhealthy amounts of radiation, And the EMFs, the electromagnetic frequency, the EMFs that come out by some of these devices are really pretty significant. So there are companies that provide, there's sort of like blockers, it's almost like pouches that you can put your phone into that kind of do radiation blocking. But the key thing is to be able to, like, don't put your phone by your head. If you use a headphone, use a wired headset, or don't put your phone. There was cases of women getting breast cancer would always put their phones in their, if they were working out in their unitard. So we're seeing some of that, and there's people that talk about 5G, that 5G can be also more problematic. So there's a whole subset of people that I've worked with. Some of them, I've been to some conferences with them. That's their specialty. They talk about electromagnetic effects, and those at the end of the day are going to be much more problematic than some of the stuff that I've talked about. I'm sorry? Yeah, there's kind of a mixed school of thought with the earbuds, because the earbuds have the Wi-Fi thing, and so that's got its own little radiation frequency. So in a perfect world, they talk about wired headsets, which can look a little old school. Remember I was watching Aaron Rodgers on the Jets. Zach Wilson was making fun of Aaron Rodgers for wearing wired earbuds, but those are less problematic from an electrical earbuds. Even though you're not putting the phone there, it still has the little Wi-Fi electromagnetism happening. So, but we're swimming in it to some degree. I mean, I don't know if there's a perfect way out of this, except by being, again, I mean, you feel your phone. If you hold it long enough, it gets hot, and there's a radiation that's happening. Yeah.
Not to be big, but there's such a huge amount of kids that are on their phone, like I said, like as young as, not your phone, but like a screen, as young as 6, 7 months or whatever. And I remember like my kids, I didn't send them to preschool, I sent them to like a warm-up program. And my 2 kids, the oldest 2, they still traumatized by the memory of having to go to kindergarten, not knowing the ABC, going to a small room, taking away. And so I'm thinking about that, and I'm like, how those kids that have been doing it for 10 years are going to be able to live with not doing it while so many of the other kids are doing it?
How are the kids who are like Waldorf kids who don't have
No,
technology?
I'm saying like now, like there's so many kids that have been on their computer for 10 years,
Yeah.
especially with the pandemic. And so how are we going to be able to, try to change that movement while so many other kids are still into it? You know what I'm saying? It's like, it seems to be like almost getting over-revolutionary thinking that,
It's helpful to find a tribe of parents that are like-minded, because it's, if your child is the only one who, then you get demonized. Oh, my parents are freak, they're overreacting, right? So, yeah, so there's a wait until group. I'm speaking to them next week in Sag Harbor on the South Fork. They have a wait until 8th group. It's a national program, but they're open up in communities, and so it's exactly what you said. You create a community, and then your kids can hang out with the kids in that group, and so they don't feel like the outlier in the group. So, but it's more challenging, because if your child's the only one that doesn't have, every kid just wants to belong, so it's helping to find community for our kids. And again, sports, music, theater, all those kinds of activities are naturally screen-free. So rather than saying, no screens for you, saying, hey, do you want to go out for the basketball team? Hey, do you want to go out for orchestra? And then that's a way to sort of get them involved in other things that hopefully tilts them in that direction and gives them community also. Yeah. Okay.
And then is there any experience with micro-learning?
Any experience with what? Micro-learning? Micro-learning, you said? So when you mean micro-learning, you mean like the what?
For adults, rather than like how TikTok is here, TikTok's there for China, right?
Well, you're talking about, so when you say micro-learning, you're talking about like short sound bites of information? Well, yeah, that's catering to all of our limited attention span, right? You may have seen it, the old thing is now our attention span is 1 second less than a goldfish. Goldfish is at 9 seconds, and the average adult attention span is 8 seconds now. That's changed over time. Our attention spans 30, 40 years ago, every year our attention span reduces because we're all getting overly stimulated, and that makes us all kind of distractible. So yeah, micro-learning kind of feeds into that, but there's something to be said for, let me lean into a long, boring book and redevelop my muscles of focus. And again, I'm as guilty as the next person, you know, like some of those short TikTok videos can, oh, okay, it's like eating potato chips, so these are pretty good, but then you got to lean into the vegetables, you know. All right, well, if there's no other questions, I want to thank you all for coming out on a cold night, and good luck in the fight. Good luck in the fight. It's worth it.